Picture this. It's a lovely sunny day. A young mother is in the park with her 3-year-old daughter, having a nice time. And then suddenly, out of the blue, a complete stranger appears and stabs the mother to death in front of her 3-year-old daughter. Stabs her viciously dozens of times. Later, he says that God told him to do it. Imagine this scene. A busy marketplace. The traders are out doing their business. They've got their families to support. Other families are out there buying the fruit and vegetables for the daily meals, enjoying a chat with their friends and a coffee. And suddenly a massive explosion rips the whole place apart, sending the flesh of these families in all directions. Somebody had strapped explosives around him and blown himself up, taking as many people with him as possible. And he was doing this because it was God's bidding. Here's another scene. 2 armies facing each other. They're led by members of the same family. They're going to have a battle which is going to wipe out a lot of the Earth's population. The reasons for the battle aren't particularly important, but the one person who might have some kind of say in stopping the battle decides to go ahead and kill his relatives, thus making many members of his family widows and orphans. And the reason he's told to do this, well, he could say God told him to do it. And God told him to do it because it was his duty. He was a warrior. Is there any intrinsic difference between these stories? They all were vicious acts of violence perpetrated for no reason other than God told them to do it. It seems to me that the one factor they've all got in common is none of these people behaved as human beings. They did not listen to their conscience. They might have had a conscience, but that was overridden by the fact that they believed they were doing God's will. In the first case, we might describe the person as psychotically deranged. In the second place, he might be described as a great martyr. In the third case, he might be described as a great hero. But if you can tell me the real difference between any of these, I'd quite like to know. They all seem to me to be people that have renounced their humanity and given their conscience away for the sake of a rather sterile notion, a notion of God. Maybe you'll argue, well, in some cases it wasn't really God that was speaking to them, they just thought it was God speaking to them. And they were clearly wrong, except maybe in one of these cases. Well, who's to say? Perhaps God was speaking to all of them. If we're going to accept that as a basis for action, how can we decide between somebody who's psychotically deranged and somebody who's inspired by God when the end result is killing for no obvious reason other than that it's the will of God? So we need to examine this very carefully. And we need to be very careful as well when we use any kind of religious teaching or spiritual teaching as a basis for such action. And this unfortunately is what we've got here. We've just had this wonderful passage about how the self is all in all, how we're essentially non-different from each other, and yet it's okay to go out and kill each other. Why on earth would the self that realizes it's the all in all, and it's non-different from anybody, that everything is non-different, why on earth would the self think it's the correct course of action to go out and kill? And this is what we've got here. In that Brahman, there is a little manifestation which is also Brahman, and that is known here as the I amness, and the world on account of ignorance and delusion. So Brahman is the absolute. In it arise notions of I am and the world, and consciousness identifies strongly with these notions. When all this is but the one self, O Arjuna, what is the meaning of expressions like this is killed and he kills, as also good, not good, unhappiness, etc.? Well, let's also ask, what is the meaning of expressions like rape, widow, orphan, torture? These things are not compatible with spiritual understanding. We've been told often enough that spiritual realization leads to love, compassion, friendship, wisdom. Where does killing come into it? We're on a battlefield here. We're about to begin this massive battle, and we're told the warriors on both sides are noble. And yet it's going to include a huge part of the human population. We cannot assume that they're all noble. And when you have battle, when you have war, you have rape, you have torture, you have widows and orphans, you have maiming, you have pillaging. That's what battle involves. Is the self that realizes the self going to engage in this? Perhaps there are times where killing is inevitable, but it's not natural for the self, the realized self, to do this. All the spiritual traditions realize this. So why this talk of killing? This is killed and he kills. What is the meaning of expressions like this? The meaning of expressions like this is that we have entered into the territory of the psychotically deranged. It's quite strange that this teaching of the one self is being used as a justification to go out and kill. I think the term psychosis is quite useful, and the phrase psychotically deranged actually applies to all three scenarios that I outlined at the beginning of this video. Spiritual understanding, spiritual realization of the identical reality in all. How can that be used as a justification for killing? Why would the self perpetrate violence against the self? We've often been told that life and death are notional, and this is true. And the realization of this puts us beyond the possibility of actually doing anything which could be interpreted as killing. It puts us beyond the capacity for violence. He who knows that the self is the witness of all these changes, and that the self is unchanged and unaffected by these changes, he knows the truth. So we must focus on the spiritual understanding here. The Yoga Vasistha has put us into what could be described as a traumatic situation, using these teachings of spiritual realization as a basis for going ahead to kill. So what we must do is reinforce our spiritual realization in the face of this outrage